Welcome to the Kino Cave, and today I'm going to be doing a book review of Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. So, my relationship with this story began in like 2018 or 2019 when Chris Stuckman reviewed the TV series. And it looked really interesting, and I always listen to his opinions anyway because I think quite similarly to him. So I was really interested in it, but I never got around to actually watching it. So for college, I had to read the book and watch the 1963 film The Haunting and the 2018 series, so that gave me the incentive to actually go and explore this story. I find that Shirley Jackson's a very interesting woman, very relatable woman as well. She grew up kind of discouraged from writing. She wasn't really pushed in that direction, but she kept at it anyway and kept going. And she went through a lot in her life, but she came out a really astounding writer. I can't wait to read more of her work. It's all really interesting. I love gothic fiction. So while I was reading this book, I watched the 1963 film, and it is one of the scariest movies I think I've ever seen. God damn, it's so scary to me anyway. I think fear is very subjective. To me, that movie was so scary, and a lot of people agree with me, including Martin Scorsese. So yeah. And then I watched the 2018 series as well for this class, and I really loved it. It's like one of my favorite things to ever come out of Netflix. I could watch it all the time. It's surprisingly comforting for a horror series that deals with a lot of tough subject matter, but I don't know, it just really resonated with me. I really enjoyed it. But I'll come back to the film and the series at a different time. Today we're talking about the book because I really enjoyed it. Getting into the characters, Eleanor is a really compelling character in the book. I found her to be very sympathetic, especially at first. She seems like someone who's never really come into her own. She's never allowed to be her true self. She was always repressed by different factors in her life, especially her family and her living situation and all that. I can see why for Eleanor, Hill House is an escape and a chance for her to really come into her own. She kind of has that like Walter White syndrome where she never really felt like she could be her true self, and the minute she does start to be her true self, it goes very wrong. I found that I really started to care for her and even fear for her, especially towards the end of the novel, but I'll get more into that when I get into spoilers for this book. In terms of the other characters, I really liked Luke. He doesn't have much to do in the story. He's kind of just there because he needs to be there because he's entitled to the house. But I think the book still does a lot with this character, especially as a way of relating to Eleanor and her situation. I find that Luke provides a lot of comfort and care for Eleanor, and so provides a lot of comfort and care for the reader as well. Luke is very charismatic and kind of mean at times. Kind of gets a little bit too much with the meanness. Maybe contributed to Eleanor having a sort of a bad time towards the end of this book. But I still found him to be a very compelling and very funny character to read. I love Theodora'S character. She's really excellent. Even more charismatic than Luke. She's very compelling. There's not a lot we learn about her. She's very secretive and very compelling in that sense. I found myself just really looking forward to reading sections of the book that are just with Theodora and Eleanor and seeing them relate to each other, and Theodora trying to bring Eleanor out of her shell. Theodora seems like that one friend that you have that just tries to get you to do stuff all the time. Like, trying to get you to break out and do things different. I really found to care for Theodora. I really felt like, despite maybe being a little bit mean, a little bit pissy at Eleanor, especially towards the end because Eleanor's going through stuff, I found that Theodora really wanted what was best for Eleanor and really wanted to care for her. I also really liked Dr. Montague. I found that he lacked a certain depth. He was kind of an exposition machine. Like, he's the one with all the facts about Hill House. He's the one who knows his way around Hill House. I found that he lacked a certain depth, but I still quite liked him, especially as an authoritative figure. I don't know why. I don't think that the characters' ages are made specific in this book, but they all seem to be adults. But I always kind of envisioned them when I was reading as kids, like teenagers, because that's really the way they act. And Dr. Montague really becomes sort of like a father figure. In terms of the other characters, they're all very minor. Mrs. Dudley doesn't really have a lot to do. Again, she kind of just provides context for Hill House. Although I found the mystery to her to be kind of compelling, and we're not really focused on Mrs. Dudley in this, so I don't really mind her lacking a certain depth. She provides an air of mystery to Hill House, and that's all she really needs to do. Then there's Arthur and Mrs. Montague. I found Mrs. Montague to be really annoying and mean, but that's very definitely the point as well. I did quite enjoy the parts of the book where they were all just making fun of her, so I quite liked that, especially as a term of, like, you know, comedic relief. And she's got that placenta or pancetta or whatever the fuck it was. I don't really know.
Placenta?
So yes, I found Mrs. Montague to be a real source of comedic relief, as well as Arthur, her assistant, who's like a teacher. I always kind of read Arthur's dialogue in like a stuffy British accent. Like, I don't know. He just seemed like one of those kinds of people. So, getting away from the characters and onto the plot, the story of this book. And the book doesn't have much of a story per se. It's kind of like a Quentin Tarantino movie, where you're kind of just following this week in Hill House and following these characters as they go through their day-to-day lives. But I found that to be really, really excellent in this book. It makes you feel like you're in the house with these people and having these conversations with them. I liked that we got to go through every day of these people's lives during their short time in Hill House. And you got to see what they did every day, what they did for fun, what they did in terms of studying Hill House and their reactions to it, and the fear ramps up every time as more kind of scary stuff happens, and you really feel like they're living dangerously in Hill House. However, this can come at a little bit of a detriment as well. I found some of these long days where nothing of worthy note really happens. A lot of times when characters are just walking around and exploring different parts of Hill House that aren't very interesting, they're like, let's go out to the garden and look at rabbits. And then they do. And then Eleanor gets like really snappy at people and then they go back. I found that to be a little bit tedious. But those are few and far between in this book. And it's a short book anyway, so I don't really see that as that big a negative. Final non-spoiler thought is the tension in this book is incredible. You really do start to feel more and more like you're in danger when you're reading as you follow the events of Hill House. And I think staying with Eleanor's character is a really smart thing that Shirley Jackson did. You feel like you're in her position a lot of the times, especially during the famous "whose hand am I holding" bit and all these other bits where there's just banging and crashing happening, and it's like it's making my skin crawl just thinking about all of these horrifying situations, and you really feel like you're trapped and that there is no escape from Hill House. Like, you are surrounded by all these horrifying things and you can't leave. So I'm going to get into spoilers for this book. I'd absolutely recommend that you read it. I'd nearly recommend that you read it before watching any of the other media. I didn't, and I still found the book really enjoyable, but I think for the sake of not comparing it to any of its adaptations, it's well worth a read, and I definitely recommend it, especially to anybody who's a fan of horror. If you're a fan of Stephen King, I think you'd love this. I quite like Stephen King, and he loves Shirley Jackson, so think of it that way. So getting into the more spoilery aspects of Eleanor's character, I found myself really attaching to her and her situation, and I was almost on her side when she didn't want to leave Hill House and wanted to stay trapped. Kind of like a Stockholm Syndrome kind of situation, but I found that her life is so shit at the beginning. Like, she spent her entire life caring for her mother, and then she spent the other few years after her mother passed away living with her sister and living as a second-class citizen, not even being able to borrow the car or to have a full room to herself. She has to share a room with one of her sister's kids, and she's really had no life. And then when she comes to Hill House, she sees an opportunity to actually have her own life. And even later on when she talks about going home, she wants to go back with Theodora, but Theodora doesn't want that because she has her own life. But Eleanor doesn't see herself as having a life outside of Hill House and the people in it. So it makes sense why she doesn't want to leave, or she does. She doesn't want to go back to the situation that she was in. I found that Eleanor really felt like her true self in Hill House. She kind of adopted the personality traits of everyone else around her and even the house itself, and found that she was made whole by being in Hill House. I also quite liked how Nell was becoming a bit more irritable as the story went on, as more of these situations started to happen to her. She starts to take more notice of the negative attributes of some of the people around her. I love the parts where we're with Nell listening to Theodora and Luke talking, and everything that either of them say, Nell is thinking, oh, that's stupid, or you're selfish, or you're like this and you're like that, and I really enjoyed those parts. I think Jackson fleshed out Nell so much that I really felt like I was on her side. I was like, no, we should stay in Hill House and be forever haunted by Hugh Crane, or slowly going insane from being in this horrible maze of a house that keeps fucking with you. Because what else is there? She's happy in Hill House. She's have a full life in Hill House. Why shouldn't she stay? Obviously, I have the logic to know that that's a bad thing, but I think Shirley Jackson wrote Eleanor so well that you're on her side. I think some of the best written characters are ones that are making the wrong choices, but you're on their side anyway. I kind of mentioned this already, but I found the comedy in the book to be really good, especially when Mrs. Montague and Arthur start to come in. I found them to be very, very funny, and just different things, like when they think they're like expert ghost hunters, but it's kind of obvious that they're just idiots playing with Ouija boards and all that. It was very, very funny, and they think they're the shit, but they're really not. I found myself to be really shook after the ending of this book. Like, I had to just sit there and think about it for a few minutes, because when you've attached yourself to all these characters, especially Eleanor, I found myself really scared for her and really just feeling for her, especially in those final few moments as she's driving away and thinking, I can commit myself to Hill House forever, and I can be here forever and be amongst this house, and I can stay here where I'm home and where I'm whole as a person. And as she's driving into the tree, she snaps out of that lunacy for just a second and realizes, what the fuck am I doing? I'm crashing into a tree, I'm about to die. And then just done. I found that to be really, really eerie and just really horrifying. To contribute to this eeriness and this feeling of dread are the opening and closing paragraphs. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone. I found the opening and closing paragraphs to really provide a sense of eeriness and add to this feeling of dread. As you read the opening and you hear these words in your head, and it provides a strange and mysterious foundation, but then when you read it at the end, it becomes in a kind of a different context and a different light. And I love reading those two paragraphs with the context of everything that happens in the book, and it provides a sense of closure, but also a real sense of dread, as if Hill House cannot be stopped. I find that Shirley Jackson might be one of my favourite, if not my favourite, horror writers. She is absolutely incredible, and she focuses on what's really important, and that is the characters. Because with horror, I feel like it's not so much important that it's the scares or even the atmosphere. It's the characters that are important. If you can't attach yourself to these characters, if I couldn't attach myself to Eleanor and Theodora and Luke and Montague, if I couldn't identify with them and feel for them, I wouldn't be so scared or concerned for them. So I found that what Shirley Jackson did, she really focused on what's important. And there's just so much to unpack in her books that I just found to be really, really interesting, and I loved it. Of course, going beyond the surface level, there's just so many different themes and allegories and ideas, themes of identity and loneliness, and even important subject matters like depression and suicide. I found it all to be really, really compelling. And even ideas that really couldn't have been talked about at the time, like sexuality, because it is pretty obvious that Theodora'S gay, and that's really awesome that Shirley Jackson got away with doing this kind of really obvious idea in a book from the 60s. I found that to be really, really interesting and compelling. Different allegories, like how the different people in Hill House react to these situations, and showing the different sides to people. So those are my thoughts on the Haunting of Hill House book. I really, really loved it. I can't wait to read more from Shirley Jackson, maybe some of her short stories, and there's another book like something about a castle, I can't remember, I'll put it down here. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Haunting a Hill House. Really, really loved it. Tell me what you think about these kind of book reviews, because I want to do more of these. It takes me a long time to finish a book because I don't have time and I'm a slow reader, but I'd still like to do these more often. Whenever I finish a book that I really like, I'd like to talk about it. So let me know, comment below, like the video, I want likes, and subscribe to see more reviews of books, games, movies, TV shows. Well,
and that's the end of that.
I didn't even start yet.
Oh, I thought that was recording.
It is recording.
Oh, roll credits.
We did it.
That's the whole video. Thank you. Good night.
Stay. Yeah, that's definitely not going in.